The doctor's office was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft rustle of papers on the large oak desk. The man sat in the slightly uncomfortable chair, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap, while his wife sat beside him, her smaller hand resting on his arm. They had been through many doctor's appointments over the past few months, but something felt different about this one. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, had a gentle but serious expression that made the man's stomach tighten. "I'm afraid the news isn't good," she began, her voice soft but clear. "The tests confirm what we suspected. The cancer has spread, and at this stage treatment options are limited." The man felt his wife's grip tighten on his arm and he looked down at her. Her face, once so full of life and laughter, was pale and drawn. She had lost weight over the past few months, and the vibrant woman he had married decades ago seemed to be fading away before his eyes. But in that moment something fierce and protective stirred within him. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's difficult to say exactly. Weeks, perhaps a few months at most. The important thing now is to focus on quality of life and making the most of the time you have together." The drive home was silent. The man kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel his wife's occasional glances in his direction. The world outside the car seemed to be moving at a normal pace, people walking on sidewalks, children playing in yards, traffic lights changing from red to green. But inside their small vehicle, time seemed to have stopped. How could everything look so normal when their world had just been shattered? When they arrived home, the man helped his wife out of the car and into their house. It was the same house they had lived in for over 30 years, the same house where they had raised their children, celebrated holidays, and weathered countless storms together. Now it felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were mourning the future they would never see. That evening, as his wife slept fitfully in their bed, the man found himself unable to rest. He wandered through the quiet house, his footsteps soft on the familiar floors. In the living room, he stopped before the bookshelf where their photo albums were kept. He pulled out the one with a faded leather cover, their wedding album, and settled into his favorite armchair. As he turned the pages, memories washed over him like waves. There they were, young and hopeful, standing before family and friends, promising to love each other for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. He remembered how nervous he had been, how his hands had shaken as he placed the simple gold band on her finger. He remembered the way she had looked at him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness, her smile lighting up the room. He turned more pages, finding photographs of their early years together. Their first apartment, a tiny place with barely enough room for the two of them, but it had felt like a palace because it was theirs. The road trips they had taken in their old beat-up car, camping under the stars and cooking meals over a small campfire. The day they brought their first child home from the hospital, both of them terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Further into the album, he found photographs of family vacations, birthday parties, school graduations, and holiday gatherings. Through it all, she had been his constant, his anchor in the stormy seas of life. When he had lost his job that one winter and had felt like a failure, she had held him and reminded him of his strength. When her mother had passed away, he had tried to be the comfort she had always been for him. A single tear escaped his eye and landed on a photograph of their 25th anniversary party. They were dancing, surrounded by friends and family, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes closed in contentment. He remembered thinking that night that he couldn't possibly love her more than he did in that moment. But somehow, with each passing year, his love had only grown deeper. As he closed the album, the man felt a resolve forming within him. The doctor had said weeks, perhaps a few months. That wasn't enough time. It would never be enough time. But he couldn't change the diagnosis. He couldn't stop the disease that was slowly stealing the woman he loved. What he could do, however, was make the most of the time they had left. He could create new memories, even if they might be few. He could show her one more time the depth of his love. The man stood up and returned the album to its place on the shelf. He walked to the window and looked out at their garden, now bathed in moonlight. It was in disarray, neglected during the many hospital visits and doctor appointments of recent months. But as he stood there, an idea began to form in his mind, small at first, then growing with each passing moment. He remembered their first date, how nervous he had been, how he had wanted everything to be perfect. He had taken her to a small Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in old wine bottles. They had talked for hours, long after the food had been eaten and the restaurant had emptied. It was the night he had known with absolute certainty that she was the one he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. What if, he wondered, he could recreate that night? Not just the dinner, but the feeling. The magic of that first date when everything was possible and their whole life stretched before them like an unwritten book. The more he thought about it, the more the idea took hold. He would work through the night, every night if necessary, to create a surprise for her, something that would remind her of the young woman she had been, of the love they had shared, of the life they had built together. It wouldn't change the outcome, wouldn't stop the inevitable, but perhaps, just perhaps, it would bring a moment of joy, a spark of happiness in the darkness that was closing in around them. With a newfound sense of purpose, the man went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. He knew it would be a long night, but he also knew that every moment of work would be worth it if it could bring even one smile to his wife's face. He sat at their kitchen table, pen and paper in hand, and began to plan. The restaurant had closed years ago, but he remembered the details, the atmosphere, the music that had played softly in the background. He would recreate it all, here, in their own home. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the kitchen window, the man looked at his notes, at the detailed plan he had formulated. It was ambitious, perhaps even foolish, given the limited time and his own advancing years. But as he thought of his wife sleeping upstairs, her breathing shallow and uneven, he felt a determination he hadn't experienced in years. This was something he could do, something he must do. It wasn't about changing the ending of their story, but about making the final chapters as beautiful as they could possibly be. He stood up, stretched his stiff limbs, and prepared to begin his work. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the world outside. But inside the house, a different kind of light was beginning to shine. The light of love determined to create one last perfect memory, one final gift to the woman who had been his everything for more than 4 decades. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long stripes across the table where the man had spent the night planning. His coffee mug, now cold, sat beside a notebook filled with his scribbled handwriting and diagrams. He rubbed his tired eyes, the lack of sleep making them feel gritty, but there was a new energy in him that pushed past the exhaustion. He had a mission now, a purpose that gave shape to the shapeless grief that had been his constant companion since leaving the doctor's office. Upstairs, he could hear the faint sounds of his wife stirring. He quickly gathered his papers, hiding them in a kitchen drawer before heading up to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, her back propped against pillows, looking even more frail in the bright morning light. Her hair, once thick and lustrous, was now thin and sparse against the pillowcase. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentle as he sat on the edge of the bed. "How did you sleep?" She managed a weak smile. "Not too well. The pain, it keeps me up sometimes." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it softly. "I'm sorry, my love. Is there anything I can get you? Just stay with me for a bit," she whispered, her eyes closing briefly. They sat in silence for several minutes, the man watching the rise and fall of her chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing. He thought about his plan, about the surprise he was determined to create for her, and felt a pang of guilt. Here she was suffering and he was keeping secrets, but he pushed the guilt aside, reminding himself that this secret was for her, a final gift to the woman who had given him everything. The moment the front door clicked shut, the man felt a shift in the atmosphere of the house. The presence of their daughter, a warm and temporary shield against reality, was gone. Now it was just him and the quiet, and the woman sleeping upstairs and the enormous weight of the task he had set for himself. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence, letting it settle around him. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to pull all the air from the house, he moved. He went to the kitchen first, the familiar territory of their shared life. He didn't turn on the big overhead light, instead using the soft glow from under the cabinets. He filled a large thermos with coffee, the strong, bitter aroma filling the small room. He grabbed a couple of sandwiches from the refrigerator, wrapped in wax paper, his hands moving with a purpose that felt both strange and right. This was his fuel for the night ahead. This was the sustenance for a labor of love. With his provisions gathered, he stepped out the back door into the cool night air. The garden was waiting for him, a shadowy canvas ready to be transformed. He had done the initial work the night before, planting the sunflowers and stringing the lights, but that had been just the framework. Tonight was for the details, the finishing touches that would turn a garden with lights into a memory. He started with the table. It was an old wooden table they had bought at a flea market years ago, its surface scarred with the history of family dinners and craft projects. He dragged it to the center of the garden, the legs scraping softly against the grass. He unfolded the red and white checkered tablecloth the restaurant owner had given him, the fabric feeling crisp and full of promise in his hands. As he spread it over the table, smoothing out the wrinkles, he could almost hear the ghost of a laugh from decades ago, the sound of her delight at finding this very tablecloth at a yard sale and declaring it perfect for picnics. Next came the chairs. He brought out 2 simple wooden chairs, placing them opposite each other. He paused, running his hand over the back of one of the chairs, the wood worn smooth by years of use. He imagined her sitting there, her face illuminated by the candlelight, a real smile on her face, not the tired, pained one she had worn for weeks now. The image was so vivid, so powerful, that it gave him a renewed surge of energy. He began to unpack the boxes from the Italian restaurant. Out came the heavy ceramic plates, a simple rustic white. Out came the wine glasses, delicate and tall. He carefully set 2 places at the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't just setting a table. He was arranging a stage for a final, beautiful act.
He placed the candles in their empty wine bottles, just as they had been on their first date, the green glass dark and mysterious in the dim light.
He didn't light them yet. That would come later. As he worked, the world around him faded away. The neighbor's dog barking in the distance, the occasional car passing on the street, the chirping of crickets. It all became a distant soundtrack to the movie playing in his mind. He was a young man again, nervous and full of hope, preparing for a first date with the woman he already knew he was going to spend the rest of his life with. He remembered the agonizing over what to wear, the practiced conversations in front of the mirror, the fear that she wouldn't like him, that the magic he felt when he was with her was one-sided. He remembered walking to her apartment that night, a small bouquet of wildflowers clutched in his sweaty hand. He remembered the way she opened the door, her face breaking into a smile that made his heart do a funny little flip. She was wearing a simple blue dress and her hair was down around her shoulders, and he thought he had never seen anyone so beautiful. The memory was so clear, so real, that for a moment he forgot where he was. He was just a young man in love, standing in a garden in the middle of the night, a smile on his own face. A sharp pain in his lower back brought him back to the present. He straightened up, groaning softly. He wasn't a young man anymore. His body protested the late hour and the physical labor. He was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond the lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of grief, of carrying the weight of his own breaking heart. He leaned against the table for a moment, his eyes closed, taking a few slow, deep breaths. He thought about going inside, about getting a few hours of sleep before the sun came up. But then he pictured her face, the hope he wanted to see in her eyes, and he pushed the thought away. There would be time for sleep later. There would only be one chance to get this right. He pushed himself away from the table and continued his work. He had brought out an old portable radio, a relic from their children's teenage years. He fiddled with the dials, searching through the static for a station that played the right kind of music. Finally, he found it, a soft instrumental melody filled with the sound of violins and accordions. It was the kind of music they had danced to in their living room on rainy Sunday afternoons, the kind of music that felt like a warm hug. He turned the volume down low so it was just a whisper in the night, a gentle background to his work. He then turned his attention to the food. The restaurant owner had packed everything in insulated bags, and now he carefully unpacked the containers. There was a rich, fragrant tomato sauce, a bowl of perfectly cooked pasta, a fresh green salad, and a small loaf of warm, crusty bread. The smells were incredible, a mix of garlic, basil, and oregano that transported him back to that little Italian restaurant all those years ago. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment, his stomach rumbling in protest. He broke off a piece of the bread and ate it slowly, savoring the taste. The simple pleasure of it, a small comfort in the midst of his sorrow. He arranged the food on a small cart he had brought out from the kitchen, covering it with another checkered cloth. He wanted everything to be perfect, to be ready. He didn't want to have to leave her side for a single moment once the surprise began. He was creating a bubble, a small, perfect world where sickness and sadness couldn't reach them, if only for a little while. As the night wore on, the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the garden. The sunflowers planted in clusters seemed to stand at attention, their bright faces turned toward the heavens. The string lights he had hung from the trees twinkled like captured stars, creating a canopy of light above the table. The garden was no longer just a garden. It was a sanctuary, a place out of time, a testament to a love that had endured for a lifetime. He stood back and surveyed his work. It was beautiful. It was more beautiful than he had even imagined. The table set for two, the soft music playing, the delicious food waiting, the flowers and lights creating a magical atmosphere. It was perfect, but it was also empty, and in that moment the full weight of what he was doing crashed down on him. He sank down onto one of the chairs, the one he had imagined her sitting in. He put his head in his hands, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. He was so tired, tired of being strong, tired of pretending, tired of the constant gnawing ache in his chest. He was doing all of this for her, to bring her one last moment of joy. But in this quiet moment, alone in the middle of the night, he was overwhelmed by his own grief. He thought about all the things they would never do. They would never take that trip to Italy they had always talked about, never see their grandchildren graduate from college, never grow old together on the porch swing, watching the seasons change. He thought about the future that had been stolen from them, a future he had taken for granted, a future that was now gone. He sat there for a long time, lost in his sorrow, the soft music playing on, the lights twinkling above him. He felt a tear slide down his cheek, then another. He didn't try to stop them. He let them fall, silent and warm, a release for the pain he had been holding inside. But then, as the first hints of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky, painting the clouds with shades of pink and orange, he felt a shift inside him. The grief was still there, a constant, heavy presence in his heart, but it was joined by something else. A sense of peace, a sense of purpose. He had done what he set out to do. He had created a place of beauty and love, a final gift for the woman who had been his everything. He couldn't change the ending of their story, but he had made the final chapter beautiful. He had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to them and created something good out of it. And in that act of creation, he had found a small measure of healing. He stood up, wiping the tears from his face with the back of his hand. He looked around the garden one last time, at the magical space he had brought to life with his own two hands. He knew he would remember this night for the rest of his life, this long, lonely, beautiful night of work and remembrance. He walked over to the table and lit the candles. The flames flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting a warm golden glow over the table. He turned off the radio. The only sounds now were the gentle chirping of the early morning birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. He gathered his things, the empty thermos and the sandwich wrappers, and carried them back into the house. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake her. He stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, listening to the silence of the sleeping house. He was tired down to his very bones, but he was also ready to face the day, ready to face whatever came next. He walked into the kitchen and started a pot of coffee, the smell filling the house with a sense of normalcy. He would make her breakfast just like he did every morning. He would sit with her just like he did every morning. But today would be different. Today he had a secret. Today, he had a surprise waiting, a final, beautiful memory to share with the woman he loved. And as the sun rose on a new day, he felt a quiet sense of hope, a belief that even in the darkest of times, love could still create a little bit of light. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long stripes across the table where the man sat. He had managed only a few hours of sleep, but the coffee in his mug was strong and hot, and the adrenaline of his secret plan was a more potent stimulant than any caffeine. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift toward the back door, his heart giving a little flutter of anticipation and anxiety. The garden was ready. The stage was set. All that was missing was the guest of honor. He heard the soft shuffle of her slippers on the upstairs floorboards, then the slow, careful descent of the stairs. He stood up, forcing a smile onto his face as she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked even more frail than the day before. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale and drawn. She was wrapped in her favorite knitted shawl, a gift from their daughter years ago, and her hands clutched it tightly at her throat. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little too bright. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, her skin cool against his lips. "Did you sleep well?" She shook her head slightly, a weary gesture. "Not really. The pain, it keeps me up." Her voice was a thin whisper, and each word seemed to cost her a great deal of effort. He guided her to her usual chair at the kitchen table, his hand resting gently on her back. "I'm sorry, my love. I've made your favorite oatmeal. Maybe that will help." While she picked at the food in her bowl, pushing the oats around with her spoon but not really eating, he chattered about nothing in particular. He talked about the birds he had seen at the feeder, about a funny story he had read in the newspaper about the weather. He was filling the silence, building a fragile wall of normalcy around them, trying to keep the terrible reality at bay, even for just a little while. After breakfast, he helped her into the living room and settled her into her favorite armchair with a blanket over her legs. He sat on the ottoman near her feet, holding her hand. They didn't talk much. They just sat together, the silence between them no longer empty but filled with a lifetime of unspoken understanding. He could feel the faint, irregular rhythm of her pulse in her wrist, a constant worrying reminder of her fragile state. Around noon, their daughter arrived. She came in quietly, putting her bag on the floor and immediately going to her mother's side, kissing her cheek and asking how she was feeling. The man watched them, a familiar ache in his chest. He saw so much of his wife in their daughter, the same kindness in her eyes, the same gentle way she had of comforting people. He stood up. "I have to run a few errands," he said, trying to sound casual. "I won't be too long." His daughter looked at him, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. She knew something was going on. He could see it in her eyes. But she didn't press him, just nodded. "Okay, Dad. Take your time." He gave his wife's hand one last squeeze. "I'll be back soon," he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with pain and confusion, but she managed a small nod. He left the house, his heart pounding. He didn't have any errands to run. This was all part of the plan. He drove to the local park and sat in his car for an hour, watching children play on the swings and dogs chase frisbees. It felt strange to be in a place so full of life and energy, a stark contrast to the heavy, somber mood of his own home. But he needed this time, this space to gather his thoughts and prepare for what was to come. When he returned home, the house was quiet. He found his daughter in the kitchen washing the few dishes from breakfast. "She's resting," his daughter said softly. "She fell asleep about half an hour ago." He nodded. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I need your help with something." For the next hour, he and his daughter worked together to prepare for the evening. He explained his plan, and her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back and set to work with a fierce determination that mirrored his own. They brought out the portable heater from the garage to make sure the garden would be warm enough. They lit citronella torches around the perimeter to keep the mosquitoes away. His daughter, who had a beautiful singing voice, practiced a few of her mother's favorite songs, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger and more confident. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the world, the man went upstairs to check on his wife. She was awake, lying in bed and staring out the window. "Hi," she said, her voice weak. "Hi, my love," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she whispered. "So tired." He reached out and smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I know, but I was thinking, maybe you'd feel up to sitting outside for a little while tonight. Just for a few minutes. The garden looks so beautiful in the evening." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She was too tired to question him, too weary to wonder why he was suddenly so insistent about the garden. She just nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. For a few minutes, he helped her get dressed, choosing her softest cardigan and her most comfortable shoes. He moved slowly and gently, his every action filled with a tender care that spoke volumes of his love for her. When she was ready, he wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and led her toward the back door. Their daughter was waiting in the hallway, her expression anxious but hopeful. "I'll help you, Mom," she said, taking her mother's other arm. The man opened the back door, and for a moment they all stood on the threshold, looking out at the transformed garden. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a brilliant shade of purple and orange. The string lights he had hung from the trees were on, twinkling like 1,000 tiny stars. The sunflowers, planted in clusters throughout the garden, seemed to glow in the fading light. And in the center of it all, the small table was set for two, the candles in their wine bottles casting a warm, flickering glow. His wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What is all this?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. The man smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. "Just a little surprise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He and his daughter helped her across the lawn, her steps slow and unsteady. As they got closer to the table, their daughter began to sing, her voice clear and pure in the quiet evening air. It was one of her mother's favorite songs, a simple, sweet melody about love and devotion. The man led his wife to her chair and held it while she sat down. He then took his own seat opposite her, his eyes never leaving her face. He could see the wonder in her eyes, the flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I don't understand," she said, her voice still a whisper but filled with a new energy, a new life. "Do you remember our first date?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at him, her brow furrowed in concentration for a moment, then her face cleared. "The little Italian restaurant," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "With the checkered tablecloths and the candles and the wine bottles," he nodded. "That's the one. I wanted to have that night with you again. One more time." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain or sadness. They were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love so deep it transcended words. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes scanning the garden, taking in every detail he had so carefully planned. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me." For the next few hours they sat together in the magical garden he had created. Their daughter served them the food from the Italian restaurant, the pasta and sauce still warm. The man poured a small amount of red wine into his wife's glass, and she took a delicate sip, her eyes closing in appreciation. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They just sat there, holding hands across the table, their eyes locked on each other, the world around them fading away until there was only the two of them, suspended in a bubble of love and memory. After they had eaten, their daughter began to play some soft music on her phone, and the man stood up and held out his hand to his wife. "Dance with me?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I'm too weak." "Just for a moment," he pleaded gently. "Just hold on to me." She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her to her feet, and she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and they began to sway to the music, a slow, gentle shuffle on the soft grass. She was so light in his arms, so fragile. But as they danced, he could feel a strength in her, a flicker of the vibrant woman she had once been. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair, the familiar, comforting smell that had been a part of his life for so long. He remembered dancing with her at their wedding, at their children's weddings, in their living room on countless rainy afternoons. He remembered the way she felt in his arms, the way their bodies moved together as if they were one. And in that moment, dancing with her in the garden he had created for her, he felt a sense of peace, a profound and lasting gratitude for the life they had shared. The night wore on, and the air grew cooler. The man could feel his wife beginning to tire, her body growing heavier in his arms. He led her back to the table and helped her into her chair. "Are you ready to go inside?" he asked gently. She nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Yes," she whispered. "But thank you. Thank you for this." He and his daughter helped her back into the house and up the stairs to their bedroom. They tucked her into bed, and she was asleep before her head even hit the pillow, a small, contented smile on her face. The man stood by the bed for a long time, watching her sleep. He could see the difference in her face. The lines of pain and worry had smoothed out, replaced by a look of peace. He knew that the magic of the garden would fade, that the reality of her illness would return in the morning. But for one night he had given her a gift, a final, beautiful memory to hold on to. And as he stood there in the quiet darkness, he knew that it was enough. The first light of dawn was just beginning to creep into the room, when the man's eyes opened. He hadn't slept much, just a few fitful hours in the armchair beside the bed. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows had pulled him from his slumber. But he wasn't tired. He was filled with a strange, quiet energy, a sense of peace that had been absent for months. He looked over at his wife, still asleep in the bed. The soft morning light illuminated her face, and for the first time in a long time, she looked peaceful. The lines of pain and worry that had etched themselves onto her features seemed to have smoothed out, replaced by a serene, almost contented expression. The man smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes. The garden had worked. It had given her this one last night of peace. He quietly got up and went downstairs, moving carefully so as not to make any noise. In the kitchen, he started the coffee pot, the familiar gurgle and hiss a comforting sound in the quiet house. He looked out the window at the garden. The party was over. The candles had burned out, the string lights were off, and the garden looked like a garden again, albeit one with a slightly magical, disheveled air. The sunflowers stood tall and proud, their faces turned toward the rising sun, a silent testament to the night's beauty. He felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the moment that had passed. But it was quickly replaced by a deep, abiding gratitude. He had done it. He had given her one last perfect memory. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, his mind replaying the events of the previous evening. He could see her face illuminated by the candlelight, her eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. He could feel her hand in his, her grip surprisingly strong. He could hear their daughter's voice, soft and clear, singing the songs her mother loved. It was a night he would cherish for the rest of his life, a bright, shining star in the dark sky of his grief. He was lost in thought when he heard the soft shuffle of her slippers on the stairs. He stood up, his heart beating a little faster. He didn't know what to expect. Would the magic of the night have faded with the morning light? Would she be back in the grip of her pain and exhaustion? She appeared in the kitchen doorway, and for a moment she looked just like she had the day before, frail and weak. But then she looked at him and a slow smile spread across her face. It was a real smile, a smile that reached her eyes and made them sparkle. "Good morning," she said, her voice still a whisper, but a stronger, more vibrant whisper than he had heard in weeks. "Good morning, my love," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He crossed the room and took her in his arms, holding her close. She felt different in his arms, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They sat down at the kitchen table and he poured her a cup of coffee, adding just the right amount of milk and sugar, the way she liked it. She took a sip, her eyes closing in appreciation. "That was the most wonderful night of my life," she said, her eyes opening and locking onto his. "Thank you." He shook his head, his own eyes filling with tears. "No, thank you," he said, "for everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just drinking their coffee and looking at each other. It was a new kind of silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of the past few weeks, but a light, easy silence, filled with a shared understanding and a deep, abiding love. "I want to see it," she said suddenly. "See what?" "The garden." In the daylight, he nodded, a smile on his face. "Of course." He helped her up and they walked out the back door into the cool, fresh morning air. The garden was even more beautiful in the daylight. The sunflowers were a riot of yellow and gold, their faces turned toward the sun. The dew on the grass sparkled like a million tiny diamonds. The table was still there, a little messy from the night before, a reminder of the magic that had transpired. She walked slowly around the garden, her hand trailing along the tops of the sunflowers, a look of pure wonder on her face. He followed behind her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He watched her as she examined every detail, every flower, every light, every candle. She was like a child in a fairy tale, completely captivated by the beauty of it all. She stopped in front of the table and picked up one of the empty wine bottles, the candle stub still inside. She held it up to the light, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" she asked, turning to look at him. "On our first date." He thought for a moment, his mind racing back through the years. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "I think I was too nervous to remember anything I said." "You told me that you loved me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We had only known each other for a few weeks, and you told me you loved me. I thought you were crazy." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet morning air. "I was crazy," he said. "Crazy in love." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "I know," she whispered. And I was too. They stood there for a long time, just looking at each other, the years melting away until they were young again, standing in a little Italian restaurant, their whole lives stretched out before them like an unwritten book. The next few days were a gift, a precious, unexpected gift. The man's wife seemed to have a new lease on life. She was still weak, still in pain, but there was a lightness in her spirit, a joy that had been absent for so long. They spent their days sitting in the garden, talking, laughing, and remembering. She told him stories he had never heard before, stories from her childhood, from her life before they had met. He listened, captivated, learning new things about the woman he thought he knew so well. Their daughter came to visit every day, and the three of them would sit together in the garden, a small, happy family unit, creating new memories to add to the old ones. The man felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months, a deep, abiding gratitude for this extra time, this unexpected bonus. But he also knew that it was temporary. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, a constant, sobering reminder of the reality of their situation. Weeks, perhaps a few months at most. He didn't know how much time they had left, but he was determined to make every moment count. One evening, about a week after the surprise dinner, his wife seemed more tired than usual. She had spent most of the day sleeping, and when she woke up, she was quiet and withdrawn. The man knew that the end was near. He could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. He helped her into the garden, wrapping her in a thick blanket to keep her warm. They sat in their usual chairs, holding hands, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. "I'm not afraid," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his heart aching. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me everything," she continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "A lifetime of love. And this beautiful memory to hold on to. I'm ready." He squeezed her hand, the tears he had been holding back finally streaming down his face. "I love you," he said, his voice choked with sobs. "I will always love you." She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a love so pure and so powerful it took his breath away. "I know," she whispered, "and I love you." She closed her eyes, a small, contented smile on her face. He held her hand, his grip tight as her breathing slowed, then stopped. She was gone. He sat there for a long time, holding her hand, the silence of the garden a deafening roar in his ears. He was alone. The woman he had loved for more than 40 years, the woman who had been his other half, was gone. The pain was immense, a physical ache in his chest that threatened to consume him, but underneath the pain there was a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance. She was no longer in pain. She was at peace. And he had the memory of their last perfect night together, a memory that would sustain him through the dark days to come. The funeral was a small, simple affair, just close family and a few friends. The man stood by the graveside, his daughter's arm around his waist as the priest said the final prayers. He felt a sense of detachment, as if he were watching the whole scene from a distance. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. He would go home and she would be there, waiting for him, a smile on her face and a cup of tea in her hand. But when he got home, the house was empty. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered him. He walked from room to room, touching her things, a desperate attempt to feel close to her. Her favorite book on the nightstand, her shawl draped over a chair, her gardening gloves lying on the kitchen counter. They were just things, ordinary, everyday things. But they were her things, and they were all he had left. He found himself drawn to the garden. It was still beautiful, a riot of color and life. The sunflowers were still standing tall, a silent tribute to the woman who had loved them so much. He sat down at the table, the same table where they had shared their last perfect meal, and he let the grief wash over him. He cried for the woman he had lost, for the future they would never have, for the love that had been the center of his world. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in his sorrow. But as the sun began to set, he felt a shift inside him. The grief was still there, a constant heavy presence in his heart, but it was joined by something else, a sense of gratitude, a sense of peace. He had been lucky. He had been lucky to have her in his life, lucky to have shared a lifetime of love with her. And he had been lucky to have been able to give her one last perfect gift, a final, beautiful memory to hold on to as she slipped away. He stood up and looked around the garden, at the flowers and the lights at the table where they had danced and laughed and loved. He knew he would keep the garden just as it was, a living memorial to the woman he had loved more than life itself. It would be a place of peace and remembrance, a place where he could come to feel close to her, a place where he could remember the love they had shared. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed a single sunflower that had been hidden behind the others. It was smaller than the rest, but it was facing him, its bright yellow face turned toward the setting sun. He walked over to it and gently touched its petals, a small sad smile on his face. It was a sign, a final beautiful gift from the woman who had been his everything. And as he stood there in the fading light, he knew that he would be okay. He would miss her every day for the rest of his life, but he would carry her love in his heart, a bright, shining light that would never go out. Their daughter came to visit every day, and the three of them would sit together in the garden, a small, happy family unit, creating new memories to add to the old ones. The man felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months, a deep, abiding gratitude for this extra time, this unexpected bonus. But he also knew that it was temporary. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, a constant, sobering reminder of the reality of their situation. Weeks, perhaps a few months at most. He didn't know how much time they had left, but he was determined to make every moment count. One evening, about a week after the surprise dinner, his wife seemed more tired than usual. She had spent most of the day sleeping, and when she woke up, she was quiet and withdrawn. The man knew that the end was near. He could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. He helped her into the garden, wrapping her in a thick blanket to keep her warm. They sat in their usual chairs, holding hands, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. "I'm not afraid," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his heart aching. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me everything," she continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "A lifetime of love. And this beautiful memory to hold on to. I'm ready." He squeezed her hand, the tears he had been holding back finally streaming down his face. "I love you," he said, his voice choked with sobs. "I will always love you." She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a love so pure and so powerful it took his breath away. "I know," she whispered, "and I love you." She closed her eyes, a small, contented smile on her face. He held her hand, his grip tight as her breathing slowed, then stopped. She was gone. He sat there for a long time, holding her hand, the silence of the garden a deafening roar in his ears. He was alone. The woman he had loved for more than 40 years, the woman who had been his other half, was gone. The pain was immense, a physical ache in his chest that threatened to consume him, but underneath the pain there was a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance. She was no longer in pain. She was at peace. And he had the memory of their last perfect night together, a memory that would sustain him through the dark days to come. The funeral was a small, simple affair, just close family and a few friends. The man stood by the graveside, his daughter's arm around his waist as the priest said the final prayers. He felt a sense of detachment, as if he were watching the whole scene from a distance. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. He would go home and she would be there, waiting for him, a smile on her face and a cup of tea in her hand. But when he got home, the house was empty. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered him. He walked from room to room, touching her things, a desperate attempt to feel close to her. Her favorite book on the nightstand, her shawl draped over a chair, her gardening gloves lying on the kitchen counter. They were just things, ordinary, everyday things. But they were her things, and they were all he had left. He found himself drawn to the garden. It was still beautiful, a riot of color and life. The sunflowers were still standing tall, a silent tribute to the woman who had loved them so much. He sat down at the table, the same table where they had shared their last perfect meal, and he let the grief wash over him. He cried for the woman he had lost, for the future they would never have, for the love that had been the center of his world. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in his sorrow. But as the sun began to set, he felt a shift inside him. The grief was still there, a constant heavy presence in his heart, but it was joined by something else, a sense of gratitude, a sense of peace. He had been lucky. He had been lucky to have her in his life, lucky to have shared a lifetime of love with her. And he had been lucky to have been able to give her one last perfect gift, A final, beautiful memory to hold on to as she slipped away. He stood up and looked around the garden, at the flowers and the lights at the table where they had danced and laughed and loved. He knew he would keep the garden just as it was, a living memorial to the woman he had loved more than life itself. It would be a place of peace and remembrance, a place where he could come to feel close to her, a place where he could remember the love they had shared. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed a single sunflower that had been hidden behind the others. It was smaller than the rest, but it was facing him, its bright yellow face turned toward the setting sun. He walked over to it and gently touched its petals, a small sad smile on his face. It was a sign, a final beautiful gift from the woman who had been his everything. And as he stood there in the fading light, he knew that he would be okay. He would miss her every day for the rest of his life, but he would carry her love in his heart, a bright shining light that would never go out.